I'm really thrilled to be joined by Dimitri and Dan today. We're going to do introductions in 1 minute. But before we get started, and as I'm watching, more and more attendees join the room, we really brought together this group to talk about these issues around bringing the right kind of technology approach and expertise because it's obviously been very difficult times for a lot of our companies and for our entire community. We know how much COVID-19 has really affected everybody, and we, the three of us on our panel today, and honestly across the community, are watching how much pressure is being put on privacy professionals, even in the midst of a crisis like this. Almost day to day, there are new challenges that we all have to take on when it comes to watching what's happening with your customer data. COVID has raised very, very challenging questions around employee data and what you can share and when people get ill. And obviously, with the way that our economy's been affected and our company's been affected, it hasn't reduced the amount of pressure on our entire community, but it has pushed us all to do more with even less. And leaders in our companies are turning to us to say, hey, can we do this? And can we do that? And can we move quickly? And there's even more pressure today to do it right, but to do it in a cost-effective way. So that's why we came together. We came together to be able to talk to everybody who's joining today, but to also try to pass along to the community, here are some ways where you can really tackle these very, very difficult issues around privacy and data protection while also trying to be really cost conscious at this really difficult time. I just wanted to take a minute and welcome our two panelists today, Dan Frank of Deloitte and Dimitri Sirota, Big ID. Dan, thanks for joining today. Do you mind introducing yourself to our attendees?
Sure. Thanks, Justin, and good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are today. I'm Dan Frank. I'm a principal with Deloitte, Deloitte Cyber Security Services practice based in Chicago. Been with Deloitte for about 15 years, 23 years overall experience in cyber risk. I lead our privacy practice here in the U.S.
Terrific, Dan. Well, listen, we're really thrilled to have you here today, and you all are obviously implementing very significant programs for large companies and small companies and advising day to day. So the ability to bring a view across the entire ecosystem and to bring sort of your insights is going to be critical to our whole community. So thank you for joining. And Dimitri, good to be on a panel with you here today from Big ID. Dimitri, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Justin. So Dimitri Sirota, I'm the CEO of Big ID. I've been with the company since inception in 2016. And I lead the company from New York, and we have staff around the world. And so excited to be on here. So thank you, Justin, for the invitation. And looking forward to the talk.
Terrific. Thanks, Dimitri. And a fellow Canuck, which I always like to remind ourselves of when we're on a panel together. Yeah. I'm Justin Antoni Pillay. I'm the founder and CEO of Wirewheel. And we also have been working in the space for several years. We're really excited about the work we've been doing, obviously, with Deloitte and with Big ID these last few months. And we're going to cover an exciting agenda, a lot to cover today. So we're going to start walking through some materials. I think we're going to focus a little bit more on the presentation here. So I'll turn that off. And our agenda is packed, especially for an hour. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities in integrating different technologies to tackle some of the privacy and data protection challenges. We're going to talk, and Dimitri's especially going to cover data discovery and how foundational that is to a lot of the technology stack. I'm going to talk about how you start tying together technologies through automation and orchestration, and some of the biggest pitfalls we've been seeing for companies as they tackle this from a technology perspective. And then we're going to focus together, Dan, myself, and Dimitri, on really operational ways that companies can really start to save money, but also bring accuracy and scalability to your privacy programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to start our conversation today on how technology integration and the right approach can really start to overcome some of the biggest data protection and privacy challenges.
Thanks, Justin. Let's start with today's most pressing privacy and data management challenges. Lots on this slide. We'll move kind of top to bottom and left to right. So if we stop in the top, or start in the top left corner, the most pressing, challenge that Justin alluded to in his intro, right, is that COVID-19 is bringing increasing privacy challenges at a time when privacy budgets are being decreased due to the economic impact of the virus, right? That's probably the most challenging issue that everyone's facing today. Second challenge is really a siloed privacy technology landscape that really lacks integration to solve privacy challenges holistically. There's technology solutions, coming out of the woodwork. Each can solve, pieces of the puzzle, but there really isn't a single, product that can do everything out there in the marketplace today. The third challenge is that privacy and data resource or talent demand is outpacing supply. It's good news for probably a lot of the folks that are on the call today, but it's a pretty good time, right, to be a privacy or a data professional. Demand is absolutely through the roof due to the operational support challenges brought on by GDPR and CCPA. These will only get worse, right, as CCPA-like laws replicate across the US and GDPR-like laws replicate globally. Many companies simply do not have enough resources and can't hire due to budget constraints. So a huge challenges for many organizations. Moving to the top right, you've got disparate consumer identities across a multitude of systems or repositories. Dan Frank, for example, has a different ID, user ID or identity in hundreds, if not thousands of systems, right? So how do I know that I'm returning everything about Dan when I get an access request? Or how do I know that I'm deleting everything about Dan when I get a deletion request if he's got multiple disparate IDs across all those different repositories? How do I know what Dan's preferences and consents are across that same hundred, if not thousands of systems, right? So the identity challenge is real. The next challenge is really manual, time-consuming, labor-intensive processes that were really put in place to kind of check the box for GDPR and CCPA. I think many companies used more of an unstructured documents type of approach, to comply. Excel spreadsheets, Visio diagrams, PowerPoints, SharePoint sites, you name it, right? Which kind of got the job done in terms of checking the box. But as I alluded to earlier, as GDPR replicates globally and as CCPA replicates domestically, those manual processes relying on unstructured documents to fulfill them are going to have a really tough time holding up with the volumes that we're going to see. The last challenge here is really enabling the business and technology while ensuring that privacy is respected and personal information remains protected. The business, as many of you are probably all too aware, is starving for data, right, to innovate. So think about your chief digital officers, your chief marketing officers, chief analytics officers, right? They have an immense need, right, for information about your consumers, right, so they can create new products, new services, and bring those, to the marketplace. The challenge is that right now, privacy is seen as an inhibitor versus an enabler of business and technology innovation, which needs to change. Let's
Yeah,
move.
Dan,
Go ahead.
I know you're going to talk about a lot of this. These are really critical issues facing our whole industry, and one of the things we've talked about a lot, even in preparing for this, is tying a lot of these systems together and thinking about ways to maintain your entire data privacy program. You've talked about this a lot. Most of the larger companies don't want to just stand it up. They have to have models to really be able to take systems off and on at the right moment to incorporate automation. It can be a real challenge. And by the way, we do have an absolutely terrific group of attendees, PhD level folks in the privacy community. And if folks today have questions or want us to focus on any particular issue, please raise them in the question and answer bar, and Dimitri, Dan, and I will address them as we're going.
Thanks, Justin. So how can we all combat these painstaking challenges? Won't spend a ton of time on this because it's really the inverse, right, of all the challenges that we talked about on the previous slide. But the first is automation or enablement, right? Reduce your reliance on those unstructured processes that I alluded to. Get rid of the spreadsheets, the Visios, the PowerPoints, et cetera, and introduce automation into processes like preference and consent management, individual rights management, um, cookie management, data protection impact assessments, et cetera, right? Those can all be moved out of kind of, that unstructured document world into a technology enabled world. Similarly, I know many companies, created their records of processing using Excel spreadsheets, SharePoint sites, et cetera. Dimitri is going to talk a lot about data discovery and cataloging today, right? There is a way to make that more technology enabled. The second piece gets to my comment around the vendor marketplace really being siloed. So it's not like you can purchase that silver bullet that exists out there to solve all of your technology enablement challenges, right? You've got to integrate vendor technology solutions, together that are strongest in what they do. The third piece is efficient resource utilization, right? So where it makes sense, right? And for some companies, it may not make sense anywhere, but leverage external help for more transactional privacy, capabilities and responsibilities to lower your costs and really focus your internal resources, right, which are scarce per the comment that I made earlier, on really strategic, value add, activities. I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit later in the presentation. Fourth piece, privacy by design and default. Many of you have already put processes in place for this in your organization, but this really becomes important when we talk about the challenge that I alluded to first and foremost on the prior slide, right, which is COVID-19 is forcing organizations to modify existing business processes and systems or put new processes and systems in place to address the challenges associated with COVID-19. Right? Think about testing employees before they return to the workforce to see if they have the virus, or tracking cases of COVID-19 via cell phone, right? Same as any other change to processing or new processing, you want to make sure that you're embedding the appropriate privacy and data protection controls by design when your organization is adapting to the new COVID-19 world. And then the last piece is just to transform the perception of your privacy function to being not an inhibitor of business and technology enablement, but an enabler. And really to do that, I'll talk about it a little bit more, but putting policies in place to automate business requests for data if the processing is legitimate versus slowing them down in the traditional world via assessment. All right. So you're probably thinking to yourself, that all sounds, all well and good, Dan, but how do we actually do it in practice? So on this slide, we give you an example of how you can potentially do so. On the right, we've listed kind of a menu of capabilities and technologies that can be integrated to technology enable manual processes and enable business and technology innovation. On the left hand side, we list goals, which invariably also equate to benefits. So let's start with the benefits and move left to right and top to bottom. The first goal, and corresponding benefit is around consumer engagement, which is really improving your engagement with your consumers, and probably most importantly, endearing them and gaining their trust. There's lots of studies out there that point to the fact that consumers are much less likely to um, exercise their individual rights, much less likely to revoke their consent, and so on and so forth, right? If they trust that what you're telling them you're doing with their data is actually true, and B, that you actually give them complete control over their data. So the capabilities and technologies that bring that consumer engagement, right, are your usual suspects, right? Consent and preference management solutions, individual rights, request fulfillment solutions, web technologies, right, which includes your cookies, pixels, tags, etc., as well as identity management related capabilities associated with multi-factor authentication, proofing, and verification. The second goal is really around governance and control. So this is managing your data at a consumer level through indexing, right? So it's the integration of identity management capabilities with your data discovery and cataloging capabilities. So you can see those, kind of moving left to right on the right-hand side of the page there. That's your discovery solutions, your cataloging solutions, request routing and fulfillment. And then I mentioned earlier, integrating those with identity data indexing, registration, and linking. Third goal here is around business enablement. This is super, super important. This gets to the challenge that I alluded to with the business being frustrated with privacy, that they can't get access to the data that they need to. They can't use it the way they want to, share it, sell it, move it across the globe, etc. And so the capabilities and technologies here are putting policies in place, right, and sharing standards that will enable the business to do that, automating the protection that surrounds that when it's given to the business. So, for example, if the business requests a certain data set, you can mask it, obfuscate it, etc., via integration with data protection types of technologies, analytics enablement, right? Those that are doing artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., and then suppression lists, right? So if a consumer has opted in or out of a certain use, sharing, sale, etc., you can control that. The last piece from a goal or benefit perspective is around business and risk reporting. So the capabilities here, obviously that risk assessment piece, whether that's internal DPIAs, third-party risk assessments, etc., technologies to monitor, incidents from inception through completion, and then perhaps most importantly, the metrics, reporting, and dashboarding, right, that you can give to varying levels of the organization to communicate the risks associated with data processing to really create kind of a data operations center type of concept. Similar to a SOC, right, on the security side of the things, but instead of integrating security technologies to monitor cyber threats and security incidents, you're integrating data discovery, data cataloging, data privacy, and identity management technologies together to monitor data risk within the organization. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dimitri, I believe.
Yeah, and look, this is a really important approach because Dan, I think both you and Dimitri and I hear this all the time. They want to. Most of the companies we're working with, they want an overall approach, and probably the number one thing we hear along the way is bring the best technology, but bring it all together. And you've covered earlier, Dan, some of the focuses on governance and data discovery. Um, Dimitri, can you walk us through this critical question of data discovery and identity resolution?
I can, Justin. I'd love to. So sure. So why don't I maybe, if you don't progress the slide, yeah. So data discovery is obviously getting a lot of attention these days, in part because it's really hard to protect data you first can't find, right? So you need to be able to locate information if you want to be able to secure it, and that's equally applicable to data privacy. I recently did a podcast with one of the co-authors of CCPA and drafters of CIPRA, Rick Arney, and he highlighted that in his view, the right to know your data is really at the essence of the California regulation, and you could argue that that's similarly the case with GDPR. But of course, at its essence, that means that you need to be able to locate all the data that you have on any particular individual. And as you can imagine, that's not easy, right? So first off, as represented by this iceberg, not all the data is data you're aware of. You may have data in shadow servers, you have data in certain tables, in files, in data lakes, in the cloud that you don't even know about. And I think increasingly what you're finding, especially as organizations grow their volume of the data that they collect and process and even share, is that data is everywhere. I think you've probably heard of comparisons to oil, and just like oil, it seeps into all kinds of places. And so that creates a higher urgency to be able to locate what data you have across your tens, in some cases hundreds of petabytes of information, both in the legacy data center as well as in SaaS and IaaS and all kinds of places. And not just the places that you would assume, right? Let's say a Salesforce leads field, because you could equally have personal information in a document that somebody stored, maybe in a notes field or a communication, in all kinds of places. And that's really kind of part of the motivation for Big ID. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about this. When we started, we felt that the existing approaches to data discovery, be they classification based, so the tools that were developed a decade plus ago, or catalog based, as they are in kind of data governance, just weren't adequate for privacy. Privacy required a rethink of how you go about finding the data that belongs to individuals. So you could see here some of the things that we felt were required. First and foremost is this idea of being able to locate not just explicitly personal information, but also contextually personal information. Things like location data, things like clickstream data, things like birthdays. Birthdays look a lot like dates, but sometimes they're personal and sometimes they're not. Gender, sometimes gender is just a description. Sometimes it's a description of you or that individual. Credentials, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Is that personal? Well, it can be if that's my password. And so being able to locate not just PII, but PI is essential. Secondly, you also need to be able to make a determination that that data belongs to Dimitri versus Justin. And that's especially hard if Justin and I live in the same zip code. So how do you know what that particular instance of zip code belongs to me and not Justin? And then on top of that, you want to be able to still classify the data so you know not just who it belongs to, but what it is. You want to be able to both catalog it, so have a view of the metadata, but also inventory it, because so much that you do in privacy is built on a PII inventory. And again, classically, you would rely on a survey, but increasingly, if you care about the data integrity and the data security and the data privacy, you want to shift towards a scan. And you can see some of the other elements that we consider invaluable in building a complete data discovery solution for privacy. If you continue to the next slide, please. So what Big ID did is we at our core developed a technology that could find PI in addition to PII. We could correlate in addition to classify and catalog, so you don't lose any of that. But equally important, you could look everywhere. And here's the challenge. When a lot of the regulators or legislators drafted the regulations, They don't know what SMB is. They don't know what Kinesis is. They don't know what Kafka is. They're lawyers. And so they didn't specify where you need to look. The presumption being you need to look everywhere. And that's hard. And no tool prior to Big ID had ever attempted that. And so what we built is a solution that could look in AWS and Azure and Snowflake and all the places that are popular today to store data. And on top of that, in all the formats, right? So it could be an element in a table, it could be an Office doc, it could be a Google doc, it could be a PDF, it could be an image of a passport, it could be something called a Parquet or a zip file, it could be at rest, or it could be moving through an API or through a data pipeline. And so you need to be able to support all of that, which again was the motivation and justification for Big ID. Next slide, please. And so what we developed with $100 million plus of investment, so we've raised, I think, about 146 million over the last 4 years from companies like SAP and Salesforce and Bessemer and others, is a first of its kind privacy-aware data discovery technology. We introduced the first company to basically do correlation, so you could find the graph of information that belongs to a person. So not just classified, but also correlated. We build the most advanced data catalog so that you could find both the technical metadata as well as the security metadata and privacy metadata all in one tool across both files, your databases, your cloud. We help you classify it, not just leveraging patterns and rules, but also ML and even deep learning, and giving you the ability to classify both a data element that may be in a table, but also a whole document. And then we also added, for good measure, a fuzzy classification. So you'll see this thing called cluster analysis that allows you to identify similarity, not exact matches, but fuzzy matches. Because when you talk about privacy and you talk about data governance, you want to have a more complete view of your data. And so again, we took that 100 million plus of investment and built the world's most advanced data discovery and data intelligence platform. Next slide, please. And how that's manifest in terms of how you build up a broader best of suite solution from these best of breed components is you surface that via APIs and something like a unified data inventory. And so that's what we've done. So we created a solution that, again, gives you this discovery in depth to truly understand your data that belongs to individuals on a 360 basis, wherever it resides or wherever it's moving, and then making it available to both a privacy professional as a scan or search-based inventory, but also to partners like Wirewheel to be able to take the information, deliver it into integrated with a DSAR request or a DPIA. And that's what Justin is going to be talking about next.
Thanks, Dimitri. And with that brings us to the question that I raised at the beginning. How do we really tie this all together to start to bring scale to a privacy program in the right way? Because when all three of us go to talk to companies, they're trying to tie a lot of things together. Often, you want to be able to leverage your SSO components and be able to have people log in the right way. You need to be able to tie together your entire flow from first touch of customer to the last touch of that customer. And we're going to talk through and show exactly how we are tying all of these different steps together in an easy way for the community. But before we jump in, Dimitri, myself, and Dan all kind of covered this in different ways, but we've seen three critical misconceptions come up when it comes to bringing technology to this very difficult challenge. The first one that we hear all the time is when a privacy office just asks for, it's often a privacy office or a company, they'll say, well, do you have connections? And there are definitely folks in the market that say, well, we have 1,000 connections, and so we'll solve your problem through connections. And what you've heard from Dan and myself and Dimitri is connecting systems is not the hard part. That's a critical part, but it's not the hard part. There's a lot more to it. And so if you get into a conversation with somebody who's trying to solve your privacy solutions by saying, "Hey, we connect it and so it's done," you still have to understand what data is in that other system. And Dimitri covered a lot of the challenges in that. You have to unify the identity. You have to know when to pull metadata or data back in order to automate either your assessments or your DSARs. And so over focusing on connections is one of the main things we see as a challenge for the community. The second is this idea that you will just get a quote bot and you'll plug a bot into all of your systems and the bot is going to figure your privacy program out for you. Um, Dimitri, do you see this kind of thing coming up from your side?
Well, I hear about people promising it, but look, my bot still can't drive my car, and certainly can't turn my lights when I walk in the house. And I don't think they're going to be able to deal with complexity. I think what I've found and what I've heard is the majority of the bots basically are just people in foreign countries doing the processing on somebody's behalf. So it's kind of like the live person type of experience. So yeah, so I think certainly it's ambitious and aspirational, but I think the reality is it still requires privacy professionals.
That's right. And you have another basic issue, which is all of us that are working with our CISOs and our technology teams. If you go to your technology team and say, "Hey, we'd like to implant a bot that's going to go sort of surf all of our data stores," that causes a pretty violent reaction a fair amount of time. So that's an issue. I do think this will be a goal for us to fully automate privacy, but I don't think we're there yet. And the third we see a fair amount is AI. Now, AI has a lot of opportunity, and we're bringing a lot of that approach, as you'll see. But I have to say, from what I've seen over these last couple of years, the idea that AI is going to remove privacy professionals and are going to replace the human judgment that is so part and parcel of the privacy world, I think is really far fetched. Um, I have a hard time believing that a bot is really going to be able to make these hard judgments about whether you've collected the right data, whether you've really thought about and classified the data, whether you've made the right judgment that it's time to move on and stop retaining that data. And so I think we're at the very, very early stages of the kinds of things we're going to be able to tackle with AI. But the idea that you're going to be able to plug AI in and then just replace your privacy office, that's just not a value that we see at this point.
Yeah, Justin, just to add to that, I think one tangible, example of that we saw over the last several years is with regards to individual rights requests, access requests in particular. Very, very, very few organizations 100% automated that process, right? Because of underlying data quality, issues, or just candidly the risk associated with returning that data without anyone, kind of verifying, its accuracy, right? So um, it's just one example that reinforces your point there.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why expertise and the community is going to be so important. Um, so, what we want to do is give some examples, some really concrete examples about how you can tie together, bring it all together with the right connectivity, with the right tools, and start fully automating over some period of time. This is going to be a curve, and this is one of those things where you have to approach it with your company in the right way, but that you can really start automating a full process around your DSARs, and even start automating around your privacy assessments. And that's where Wirewheel has really focused. We have focused on an open community of finding the right partners to bring to the table with a model that helps a company tie it all together. Because our view is, number one, if you just go and give a portion of the solution, it doesn't really help advance it for the community. And two, our customers need a model of how you can stand it up, connect the right tools, leverage your existing solutions, and make this all work together. So for us, in this partnership with Big ID, for example, you see some really interesting opportunities to fully automate, tie systems together, and leverage the right tools at the right moment for not only automation, but orchestration. Orchestration meaning you've touched the right systems in the right order to start fully solving your problem around, for example, data subject access. So, if we watch how this flow works when you get to a fully automated solution, let's start with one of your customers. One of your customers comes to your site and they want to request their data. The first step you need is, of course, something that actually conveys trust to your your customers and consumers and even your employees, and tells your story on a privacy front. One of the things we noticed in the last couple of years at Wirewheel is even if you go to your business leaders and your CEOs and you talk about how important trust is to selling your product or your services, there's almost 100% agreement. And yet, when you go to many privacy sites and data protection notices, they still look like they were built in like 1998 at the dawn of Internet Explorer. And so we focused on being able to enable a company to stand up a beautiful interactive trust center that brings those just in time notices to your customers and enabling you to build a fully customizable form that actually collects those access requests in a much more automated way, including the ability to trigger conditionals based on the answers. So imagine you now have a customer that's coming to your site powered by Wirewheel to register the request. You can then easily stand up, now that we've integrated with solutions with like Big ID, a fully automated solution. Now, of course, once you've created that first request, um, one of the things we focused on is in the privacy community, it's very difficult for privacy folks to actually get resources to build and manage the notices and the information that's being passed to your customers. And so we have a module in Wirewheel that's called the Privacy Studio. It's what you see is what you get. You can build out the information, manage your privacy policies, and even in a nice interactive way, build out these fields so that you're collecting the right information in connection with each request. Now that you've actually created the request, of course, you need to verify and authenticate who the request is from. I think the entire community has worried about this. How do you know that when Justin's making a request, it's not actually Dimitri or Dan? And there are different kinds of verification and authentication that you can bring to this challenge. We have built-in turn on and turn off solutions that allow you to do full ID verification, including with IDs and passports. You can even turn on knowledge-based questions and configure it in a way so that depending on the nature of the data that you're going to be turning on, the nature of the resources that Big ID finds, and your judgment of the sensitivity, you can conduct ID checks, selfie checks, turn on an affidavit so that your customers are actually collecting that information as you go. And in more sensitive use cases, we can actually leverage full knowledge-based questions. Now we turn to a check against Big ID. So through our fully integrated solution to work together with Big ID, now if you have a customer record that has been discovered in your automated processes on Big ID, as Dimitri has covered, Wirewheel, following collection of that initial request, can go to look at Big ID and other systems and actually collect the data and verify that the customer record is present automatically. So here we have that request we just created a few minutes ago. It's ticketed in your system. And you can see that we have automatically identified that this user is actually already in Big ID. You can see that we have a customer user ID for Big ID, the core customer record, And we've confirmed that it is a valid customer from the Big ID side. This is how you start really automating your processes. Because for our community, having somebody go system by system to collect that information and do it via workflows can just take too long. Of course, all of us are living with the challenge that even where you have onboarded systems to Big ID, even where you know where that data is and you want to be able to collect it in an automated fashion, you need at various times to be able to do a workflow collection to a person in your building. There may be an edge system. It may not be worth fully scanning it, or for some reason, it hasn't been onboarded into a partner like Big ID as well. Now, these can be assigned automatically within the Wirewheel system. So here you see a request that's for a legacy billing system. It's been assigned out automatically upon the creation of that core customer record. In this example, we're going to say, no, there's no data ready. And now we go back to our core customer record and we go to the next step, which is critical, which is now that we've automatically retrieved all of that data, including the customer record from Big ID, now that we've confirmed and we have an audit trail that there's no other data from the manual systems, we have to make that report understandable to a customer. This is a core critical requirement to be able to map from other systems where the data might come in JSON format and actually produce beautiful PDFs that are understandable to a customer. So here we have that data that has been pulled back from Big ID in an automated form. Wirewheel has now converted it automatically into a beautiful interactive PDF that has formatted that data in a way that's also understandable to a consumer. And so you start to get to the point that you've now, from the moment of a request, you've automatically confirmed and verified the human being, and you can create these audit trails to make sure that it has met your internal requirements. You bring back the report, you have formatted it, you have generated a PDF, and you can deliver it back to the consumer in an encrypted format and take care of this in a much shorter window. From the customer's experience, this again is the admin experience where we're sending the data off that final PDF to the customer, and now you send it to the portal. Customers can now come in to their own data portal. They can either access directly by logging in or via an encrypted code. They can see that the request has been delivered. They can delete it and manage it right from the site. And there you have a fully delivered report back to the customer. And of course, critical to all of this has been that as part of it, Wirewheel is also tracking all of that critical data at every moment. So for this community, the ability to generate the critical reporting that maps to the CCPA requirements, to have the audit trail, and to have those charts and other reports that you're going to be able to deliver to your customers is a critical part of the overall delivery of the system. And that's one of the ways in which we're really trying to fully orchestrate across taking the requests, pulling the ID and the record back from Big ID through our integrations, being able to collect other data via API or via manual workflows, pulling that data back in automatically, and of course, delivering it in a new way back to the customer. Dimitri and I, one of the things we're covering today is tomorrow, we're expanding our partnership. Dimitri?
Yeah, we'll be announcing support for PIAs and other types of assessments done in Wirewheel using our inventory and data flow. And again, it's part of our commitment to being an open platform, to working well with others. Justin and I are both Canadian, as he said in the beginning, and I think it's a cultural trait. And I think that we want to give organizations, more to Dan Frank's kind of earlier points, the feeling of a best of suite capability through best of breed components. that just work together seamlessly. And so you'll see some press around that tomorrow.
Yeah, we're excited about that too, Dimitri, and we've taken the same approach. And we wanted to cover just briefly, what does that mean? What does it mean to start really automating a privacy impact assessment? And so, you start with our privacy professionals who are initiating privacy impact assessments. And these can be manual, and we know the pain that a lot of our community has had around these. We all know that, of course, GDPR drove a lot of our first round of privacy impact assessments. And we also know that CCPA 2.0 is very likely to pass in November, which will be the first US law that really requires these kinds of privacy impact assessments here in the US. Now, once the PIA is initiated, we can call into Big ID and understand the kinds of systems, the kinds of metadata, and the classification that you've already done in Big ID. Of course, part of a privacy exercise is not only are you calling for the kinds of data and the metadata and the classification, we have to collect other information about our systems. Things like, what is your security posture, understanding your retention policies, understanding the use, and we can automate those via workflows on Wirewheel. All of this information is then pulled back into a completed privacy impact assessment or a data protection impact assessment, which is available for review by your teams. So we're looking forward to a longer path here where we can really start tying together your systems in this way, so that you're not only managing your privacy compliance needs in privacy assessments, vendor management, and more, but that we're, from the first time that your customer comes to your website, that you're able to surface those notices and trust centers. You're able to manage access requests, do not sell requests, and deletion requests, and of course, manage their preferences and deletion at the end of that chain. Dan, I think we're going to cover these next two slides. We do have a few questions coming in as well. But why don't we turn back to this overall approach with you, Dan, and how you can think about the organizational benefits of fully automating these kinds of processes.
Thanks, Justin. And just a reminder to everyone, you can use the Q&A function to submit questions. We're going to be done here in just a few minutes and start answering questions. But to kind of close things out, right? This whole session was, about, how do you integrate technology, for cost savings. This slide here talks about how multiple business functions within an organization benefit, right, from the integration of these technologies together. And when you think about it, it's most, if not all, business functions. On the left-hand side of the slide there, you can see a lot of your risk and compliance functions, right? Privacy, security, internal audit, compliance, et cetera. They benefit, right, through the automation of these processes that we've been referring to. On the bottom of the slide there, you can see your technology function and data governance function, right? Your CIO and your CDO, they benefit from the integration of the technology because they're responsible, right, for the discovery and the cataloging the information, as well as putting the technology in place to return the data to the individual or delete the data in the event that they request deletion. And then last but not least, on the right-hand side of the page, you could see all those business functions that have a vested interest in getting access to the data so that they can use it, share it, sell it, et cetera, for business and technology innovation purposes. So that's relevant because with consensus across the organization, you can realize benefits from a variety of stakeholders justifying the cost of investment. Last but not least here, we talked about transactional activity or responsibility cost-saving opportunities. There's a number of them listed, on this slide. Obviously, not going to read all of them to you, but there are ways, right, where you can free up resources to work on more strategic aspects of your program and leverage partners to handle more transactional things like PIAs, metrics and reporting, handling inquiries and complaints, connecting to additional systems from a discovery and cataloging perspective. There's a multitude of opportunities to do so. So with that, why don't we open it up to Q&A?
Terrific, Dan. And we do have a good set of questions that have come in. So why don't I start with uh, the question about identity verification. So one question we had, and Dan, you can start, or I'm happy to as well. I'm sure Dimitri, you can jump in. What's the best practice today for validating the identity of a data subject access request? Dan, do you want to jump in, or I'm happy to.
You can start, Justin. That's fine.
Sure. Um, and Dimitri jumped in with an answer too. We always start. This is where human judgment matters. What is the nature of the data you're actually going to be turning over? If it's not overly sensitive, we've often found our customers really looking at the lightest weight versions of authentication, which might be email validation, mobile ID validation, and an affidavit of some kind, which of course in the US is often subject to wire fraud and those kinds of laws. More sensitive data, we're seeing the following. A check against a big ID kind of system or a CIAM to make sure that the data you're getting is actually correlated with those systems. Checking an ID, for example, an ID check, a passport check, together with a selfie check so that you have some sense of whether the same person, more sensitive use cases with banks and financial institutions, we often see a liveness check where you're trying to make sure that the person actually is holding the ID in some way. And then finally, we have built-in solutions, for example, with Axiom, and we're partnering with more every day around knowledge-based questions, where a user is surfaced with some questions they would only know the answer to. The main thing that I would surface around ID verification, and we've spent a tremendous amount of time on this, is make sure that in conducting these kinds of ID verifications, that you don't create a bigger headache for yourself with the personal data you're collecting. We have done a lot to make sure there's data minimization and retention rules around IDs and knowledge-based questions, because if you start taking IDs yourself, you start collecting knowledge-based information from your customers, you could become a controller for a lot of very, very sensitive information. And that's probably one of the biggest worries we see. Dimitri, Dan?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, Justin, I think you hit on a lot of the usual suspects. The other way to do is via multi-factor, right? Authentication. So sending a one-time PIN to a cell phone that you have on record, those types of things.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that, and I think it's so much kind of what you're doing with Axiom, but we do this for some of our customers. The data itself provides you a profile of the information that you gathered on that particular user, and similar to the old IVR systems, you could challenge them with specific questions based on the data that you actually have within your organization. So again, once you find it, you could use that to provide a secondary step of validation.
No, that's exactly right. I agree, Dimitri, and I agree, Dan. Those are great additions. Second question, with this integration, how soon will a DSAR request be responded to? Is this real time or will it take hours a day? So Dimitri, how fast is Big ID?
So super fast. But the reality is that we want to be able to give you a just-in-time profile. So if you're going to look across all your data, the last thing you ever want to do is create a copy of all your data, especially when you're dealing with personal information or crown jewel information. So it's always bad form to make a copy of it and then index it and do something that is, because essentially what you're doing is you're creating a honeypot for bad actors. So the way Big ID works is there's a two-step discovery. First is this kind of mapping of your information to identify where you have hotspots. So similar to understanding where there's valleys, where do you have mountains, where do you have streams, where do you have oceans. When, let's say, a tiger wants to know what data you have on it, you could avoid looking in the ocean because a tiger doesn't swim in the ocean or the river. And with the exception of one type of tiger, you probably aren't going to find them on a mountaintop either. And so Big ID goes back in and gets the latest and greatest information in files, in your data lake, in your SaaS, in your IaaS, in your data warehouse, in your mail. And so the length of time will depend, typically depending on the data state. It could be hours. It could be a day or two, but certainly it's within the 30 or 45 days that you're required. And again, what's critical about it is it's the latest and greatest. And then within Big ID, you could even define a deletion workflow and even validate that once you think you've deleted the data, that the data stays deleted, so it doesn't reappear because of some backup restoration. And so again, I would say hours to a couple of days. But what's important about it is you get a fresh look at all the information you have, which is critical if you're doing a deletion. And then again, being able to perform a validation on that deletion.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Dimitri. Dan, from your perspective, what are you what when you're working with companies, are you getting like SLA requests, or like what is the rough time you're seeing in the market where folks want these things fulfilled, if that's come up?
Well, certainly by the time frame that's required by the corresponding regs that are in scope, right? Whether it's 30 days, 45 days with the extension, 90 days, that type of thing. Um, Nobody wants to go past that threshold, right, and put themselves in a position where they're not defensible, right, and that individual can complain to whichever regulatory authority is applicable there. Um, just to add to Dimitri's comment there about speed, I think it has to deal with a couple of additional things that I just thought of. One is the extent to which you've automated, right? So what I mean by that is Big ID is a very powerful tool, right? But if you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of systems, and you've only connected to 10% of those or 15% of those, right? Then guess what? The rest of those that have personal information in them are more manual processes, right? You might be able to trigger a workflow, as Justin demonstrated, to let those groups know that they have to go and produce that data file, but it still will take longer than those systems that you've automated via Big ID. So that will contribute to the response time. The second piece that I think contributes to the response time is underlying data quality and data integrity issues, right? A number of organizations that I've worked with, right, introduced the automation, but what they found as they tested the fulfillment of those individual rights requests was that because of underlying data integrity and data quality issues within the systems of record, they were having to do a lot of manual work, right, on the back end, even once the data was produced, to fix it, right, to correct data issues, data that had been produced that wasn't even the individuals, et cetera. So there's a fundamental requirement here that you have strong data quality and integrity. And then the third piece, when it comes to deletion requests, integrating into your request workflow analysis of your data retention and disposal policy and corresponding schedule, identifying which systems can and cannot be deleted from, et cetera, is going to speed up those requests.
Again, I think right on point. And we often are taking a sort of a walk run approach, um, Dan, with our customers, where there'll be some critical systems that you want to automate as quickly as you can. There'll be ones in which you're either the data quality is not good, or you're not sure you're going to get enough requests to make a fully automated solution necessary. It is very important, obviously, to have a workflow solution that can really track against your deadlines. You just don't want to miss a deadline, obviously, because of something like that. And almost always, even these fully automated solutions, as Dimitri was talking about, they're asynchronous. They really are. The biggest systems and the most complex ones that we work with, it's not going to call all of the data back or delete all of the data back instantaneously, but it'll do a lot to take the time and work out if you really start automating it that way. Okay, another question we have is how would we work with an existing PIA tools? For example, if a customer already has a PIA tool and wants to do a DSAR with Wirewheel, how would that work together? We of course do that all the time, and you can. We both Dimitri and I have been working on our partnership because we view a lot of this world as needing an open ecosystem in which you can leverage the right tools and not replace what you have. And so if you've done your assessments on one platform, as long as you understand and have a sense of your major sensitive systems, the ones that you're going to be tackling for CCPA, we can easily onboard systems onto Big ID. We can connect others via workflow. That's kind of the process we do. So there are a lot of ways we can tackle it. And the only other thing I'd add before I turn it over to Dimitri and Dan, being able to leverage existing systems is really critical in my view. This is a lot like the early days of cybersecurity, where you're going to bring the best tool, you're going to bring some existing technologies to the table, and we want to be able to leverage what you already have. And Dimitri, I assume you're working with all kinds of tools, where somebody's done an assessment, and it might even be in Excel.
It may be even something Deloitte has built. So yeah, no, 100%. Look, I think the reality is you don't want a closed system. You want an architecture that is going to be able to support and build on the investment that you made. And again, I jokingly talked about, when you're born in Canada, you can't really choose who you're going to partner with. You need to be flexible, right? Because you have somebody large and sizable kind of just south of the border from you. And I think that does inform some of our decision making. And so whether it's via APIs or importation, export of CSVs, I think you want to be able to be flexible, and you want to be able to build on the investment that you made and grow it as opposed to replace it.
Dan?
Yeah, not a ton to add there, Justin. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? That's the whole premise. It's why I talked about at the very beginning of the call, right? One of the first things I hit on was the vendor technology landscape being fairly siloed, right? Everybody's got their strengths, but you have to be flexible and be able to integrate solutions together to solve the problem, holistically. And I think you and Dimitri demonstrated two primary examples on today's call.
Terrific. Well, listen, we're running out of time, so I'll just cover the last question from our side was, is our solution cloud or on-prem? I think Big ID is deployable either way, but Dimitri, I'll let you handle that. Wirewheel is a cloud-based platform, and we have a fair amount of support, however, and can automate whether your systems are on-prem, in the cloud, in a SaaS system, or have been onboarded into a data discovery platform. So because we have focused on that orchestration element, we have a lot of ways that we can safely and securely work with your existing systems. Dimitri?
Yeah, so we have three options. We have an option where customers could run it themselves in their data center or in their cloud, like AWS, Azure, GCP. We're partners with all three. And it's all modern kind of microservice, if you're familiar with that terminology. There's another option where somebody like Deloitte can manage it on behalf of customers. So that exists as this kind of managed service by a third party. And then we also have a Big ID cloud managed option as well. So again, it's all about choice, and Big ID gives customers choice.
Terrific. Well, we in the screen, you can see a place where you can actually sign up and get a more specific demo. Obviously, we work very closely with the team at Deloitte as well on a lot of these, Dan. Listen, from my perspective, thank you both very much for joining today. I know this is a tough time for all of us, but to find a way that we can try and share some insights to our whole community, I think is really important. And I really appreciate the time from both of you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Dan.
Likewise. Thank you, Justin. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Be safe.
Be safe.